welcome to Revolutions Weekly, where we dive into the details of our many periodic revolutions, elections. I'm your host Alvin, and this week we're finally turning a new leaf and moving over a few continents over. So after 5 grueling weeks, 5 amazing weeks, 5 interesting weeks of being able to cover the 5 Indian regional elections, we're gonna move over now to Europe, where we're gonna be covering even more regional elections. But in this case, I feel like it's really significant because we're covering British elections, but it's not, the general is not happening, but it is significant because it involves 2 major regions in the UK, namely Scotland and next week Wales. So, if you know what's been going on with Scotland in, recent times with, like their independence referendum and all these kinds of things, you would know, of course, that things have been, pretty shaky to say the least in the Union. So, of course, with the independence vote and then, with Brexit just, mucking everything up, it's kind of like really like an uncertain future as to what's going to happen there in the UK. So I feel like, like elections kind of like paint like this really nice picture, and it kind of gives you like a glimpse into like the actual political circumstances, because I think it's like one of the few things that, you could really, that's really designed, like accidentally to actually reflect the will of the people. But anyways, so as I said earlier, so this week we'll be covering the Scottish parliamentary elections, and next week, like I said, we'll be covering the Welsh parliamentary elections. Now, both of these elections actually happened just last week, so May 6th. Now, if you notice, this episode's slightly later, and it's definitely not because I'm just being a bit lazy. No. There's a good reason, because I think like the results only came out on the 8th. So the thing is, like, then to actually make this episode properly, you have to have the results. So that's what I was waiting for. But anyways, now that we do have the results, let's get started. So, so like first of all, you might be thinking, like, what are like the Scottish parliaments? So, if you talk about like, other states, other regions, like a lot of them have like parliaments and things like that. But I think in the UK it's a bit different because, the UK, being a much smaller country and like, being a united kingdom since like 1707, has really ever only had one parliament, and that's the national one in Westminster. So what this Scottish parliament basically is, it's basically an attempt at devolution. So basically, like the Scots, like they want to see more autonomy. They want to see, they want to see themselves having more control over, like local matters, like domestic affairs, education, agricultural policy, tourism, these kinds of things, minor things like that, but also, major things like, like economic policies like taxes and things like that. So that's where that came from. So basically they had a referendum in 1987. And, people said, yes, like, we want a parliament of our own. And that's why it was established in 1999 with these, like, sort of, like, overreaching powers over Scottish domestic policy. Now, of course, like, they are still subservient to the parliament in Westminster. And, like, a lot of times they would have to, like, send over what they passed over to Westminster to be passed, to be stamped, essentially, by the national government. But, like, as it is right now, like, the parliament does have a lot of power. And we'll get to what some of these powers are in a bit, especially the really important ones. So, like I said, like they have powers over domestic policies, but, of course, like a lot of things like foreign policy, like national defense is, of course, still set by London. So don't get it twisted. So it's like, imagine, like, this is like a state parliament, but the reason it's unprecedented, the reason it's important is because there was not a quote-unquote state parliament before this existence of the Scottish Parliament. So anyway, so what does this body look like? So it's a 129-seat body, and it's uniparliamental, meaning that there is only the one parliament, no upper house. And, because of it's 129, they need 65 to form a majority. And, the way it is, like, it's a British Westminster system. So, the whole thing would first past the post. But what's interesting here is, while there are first past the post constituencies, it's actually more of like a hybrid system. So, like half of it is like the Westminster system, the one that you see in Britain, the one that you see in India, where it's like, the parliament is essentially king. So that's where the cabinet comes from, that's where the prime minister comes from, things like that. So you have, like, and the way that's voted in, of course, is through constituency, meaning that, whoever passes the post first past the post, gets the seat. But so there's that system as well. But then there's also this other part of the system, which is more of a proportional representation system. So more or less the breakdown is about 73 MSPs, so member of the Scottish Parliament, are elected with the first past the post, and 56 of the remaining are elected by proportional representation from 8 electoral regions. So basically, in case you don't understand, so proportional representation basically is, when you like tally up all the votes of a particular, region, this big region, not like a district or like a constituency, but like a big region, and just kind of like divide up the seats allocated to each region just based on that. So in Scotland, there's about 8 of those. So essentially what they do is like they kind of add these two numbers together, and that's how you get 129. And strategically, this is actually really interesting because like it kind of like opens up a lot of nice implications. So anyways, now that we got the technical stuff out of the way, now let's talk about what the government actually looked like before this particular election. So if you kind of like follow closely British politics, or if you don't really know it yet, don't worry, I'm here for you. But so what's going on in Scotland is basically, so we have this party called the SNP, in case you don't know. So it's the Scottish National Party. Now, I think that just based on the name itself, you kind of like know, of course, like one, they'll probably, most of its constituents, or not actually all of its constituents, probably be in Scotland. And like, secondly, like this idea of like a national party, meaning, it's like they're probably going to be the ones pushing for independence. And in fact, that is the case. So, the SNP has been in power, like pretty much, for almost like a decade, more than a decade, basically. So, and they're basically definitely a dominant player in Scottish politics. Not so much, of course, in national politics, nor would they be, because why would a party advocating for Scottish independence be like a prominent player nationally? But anyways, so they're basically prominent in Scotland itself, and they've basically been kind of like the biggest, factor, the biggest, advocate for an independent Scotland. That's why they're really significant in Scottish politics, but also in British politics, largely because, they're a pro-independence party. But, like you might think they might, be like a minority of, as, most so-called independence party are, but, no, but in the case of SNP, you actually see a majority basically, so they actually run the government and things like that. But while they did have a majority for like most of their time and tenure in power, the election before this one, the 2016 election, actually saw them losing some seats. So basically they have 61 seats, and if you remember what I said back there, you need 65 to be in a majority. So essentially what's been happening these last few years is that the SNP has been running essentially a minority government. Sometimes they rely on the Scottish Greens, the Scottish Green Party, which, the Green Party nationally, of course is, pro-British and things like that. But the Greens in Scotland, for some reason, are also pro-independence. So, because everyone else isn't pro-independence, their only ally really is the Greens, and the Greens themselves have 5 seats. So I guess that's basically how they've just been getting through things through Parliament. And, the other parties, you have, like, the big names, and if you do follow British politics, you will definitely know these names. Like Conservatives, like the Tories, who are currently in power in London, they have 30 seats, Labour with 23, and, and the Lib Dems with 5. So, that's kind of like more or less what it is, like, besides, like Conservative and, like, upper edge over Labour, like, which is the trend in most places in the UK. You see the SNP just absolutely dominating Scottish politics, and it's for good reason, because the people of Scotland, a good amount of them want independence, but then also, like they are a party explicitly advocating for, Scottish rights and like just like Scottish issues, so which makes sense, I suppose. So anyways, so coming into this election, like what are the issues, like what are like the big like events which kind of like shape these so-called issues, and like what's going to be happening and what are the implications for this election. So, of course, like if I like the way I alluded earlier, so like I said something about like like the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. Now, of course, that failed. I think it's like 45% of people want independence and 55 didn't. So things like it was a relatively slim margin, but still like I think like at the end, ultimately, like they didn't get independence, and this referendum was actually pushed by the SNP. Now, the reason why this is more significant than just plain advocacy is actually because one of the most significant powers of the Scottish Parliament is actually to vote for, to ask for an independence referendum. So basically what it was is that basically they would be allowed to vote on whether or not they would want a referendum. And so in this case, the parliament did vote yes in a majority because the SNP had the majority, and they basically sent this request over to Westminster, and Westminster can either say yes, you can have the referendum, or no, you can't. So in 2014, they greenlit the referendum. So, they actually had a referendum, I think it was like 20, 30 years before this, and, that one failed as well. But it's always been, the SNP behind, like the push for referendum, and they've always been relentless about it, to the ire of Westminster. Now, so that failed, that came and went, but the SNP is still in power, and I think that's probably why, like, they lost seats ultimately, because like, the referendum ended in, like, a whimper, like, the hype kind of died down as well. But, then, we have the 2016 Scottish elections, and, like, that's when I told you, like, they lost a couple of seats. Not a lot, but, like, enough to, like, make them have to run a minority government. But then, a few months after that election, things kind of got awkward, because then, you had the 2016 Brexit referendum. Now, of course, if you remember this referendum, well, yeah, of course, like, the Brexit side won. And this is an even slimmer margin. It was like 49 to 51, I think. It was something crazy like that. But, this literally happened a few months right after. And, and I think initially, like, when they actually did this referendum, they didn't think it would actually, like, go through. But, and, the Tories, the Conservatives, were basically just trying to, like, score political points. Well, like, I guess they thought along on that. So basically, like, in 2014, they kind of let the referendum happen because they wanted political points and to put to rest the issue of Scottish independence once and for all. In 2016, they also wanted political points, while also putting the Brexit issue to rest once and for all, and to also silence the Brexit camp within the Conservative Party itself. But this one went through, so now, they're put in this, like, awkward position. So, and if, you look at the map, and this is kind of, like, always been, like, a recurring issue these last few years, is that essentially, while most of England and most of Wales voted for Brexit, almost all of Scotland didn't. So almost all of Scotland actually wanted to remain in the EU. Now, of course, if you know population density, England has way more people than Scotland, which is why the vote ultimately went through, even though it was a pretty slim margin to begin with. But anyways, so basically most of almost all of Scotland wanted to be a part of the EU because of like the trade relations that they could have. And just like, I think in general, I think it's like the Eurosceptic crowd are mostly English. And that's probably like derived from like their like national identity of like, being an island nation away from so-called continental Europe. They've kind of like developed this kind of like ire, this kind of like hate, not like a really like passionate hate, but like a hate for, the rest of like Europe, and just like kind of seeing themselves as completely different. That's where like the English hating the French and things like that came from. But anyways, so that's because so it was mostly like the English and Welsh votes which ultimately, caused Brexit, which is why Scotland, I guess in that sense, felt left out. And, they were, because they were part of the UK, they had to be kicked out of the Union too. And so, some Scots didn't want that. So that's why this issue of independence was again reinvigorated, was again, given some life, because if Scotland wanted to be part of the EU, well, then it would technically have to leave the UK. So now, the pro-independence camp has a more compelling argument for Scottish independence. And so that's basically what's been brewing these last few years. And then, of course, other than all of this thing going on in the background, there's, of course, just the everyday issue of, COVID and just how that's been handled. So I think it's like pretty much, for the most part, in England, I think it's like they've kind of handled COVID relatively well. In most of Europe, they've kind of handled it relatively well. I think it's like in Scotland, and I guess like in Wales as well. Like they've kind of like like their own local governments have kind of like gotten praises for being able to handle it properly. But so that's not really much of an issue per se on its own. But COVID is still a big issue, so it's not like you can't just ignore it. So basically, what we kind of have here ultimately is like a clash between the issue of Brexit and Scottish independence and the issue of COVID, and then which one should take precedent. So that's, I think, ultimately the tone that I got from like the debates, the tone that I got from like the rhetoric is basically that they're like, which one should we prioritize even more? So of course like I said, the SNP and the Greens are of course pro-independence, but like they kind of did the smart thing of like saying, while we are pro-independence and we do want a referendum eventually, what's kind of important right now is how we deal with COVID, how we handle it, how we manage it. So of course, they walked that fine line of like, yeah, we want independence, but not now. Now, the Conservative and the Lib Dems basically kind of like, of course, like pro-union, pro-UK parties. And of course, they kind of did this like thing where it's like they kind of painted the SNP and the Greens as being, people who don't prioritize COVID and instead are like relentlessly pushing this like vote for independence, and they keep saying, it's not the time, and it's like, what are you doing, things like that. So I think the Conservatives are like the most aggressive in this messaging about, and of course, Conservatives and the SNP don't exactly see eye to eye, so you could see why that's the case. But basically what it is that like, they kind of paint this picture of like, yeah, like I said, like the current government's not really focusing on COVID. They're focusing too much on independence, yada, yada, yada. So basically that's why, like we have the bad quote-unquote situation that we have now. Anyways, now Labour, in line with how they've been doing since the general election like 2 years ago. So basically how they've been doing is like, they've just kind of like had this issue with messaging in general. So for example, in 2019, they tried to basically appease both the pro and anti-Brexit crowd by saying, let's have a second referendum. But then, of course, like people saw that, as them trying to negate the issue. And so that's why ultimately they didn't get the votes that they needed, because people really didn't like see in them a plan, a path for Brexit. And whereas people wanted Brexit, they kind of shown that they did. So in Scotland, Labour did a similar thing where they wanted to do a third option, quote unquote, third option. What that is honestly really vague. So basically they say, we don't want to talk about Brexit and Scottish independence or COVID. We want to go on a different path. But what this different path is so vague. So basically, so people didn't really know what they were voting for if they voted Labour. And so that's why Labour ultimately didn't get a lot of traction in this election. And just in general, I think it's like Labour nationally has just been really shaky. So that's like probably why in Scotland they didn't really fare all that well either. So anyways, now we got the polls. Now, of course, the results are out already, but, like, what were the polls saying before the results came out? So what the results show is basically, SNP being the dominant player in Scottish politics that it is, was slated to take power again. But, but their chances of a majority is still up in the air in that, like, they will get the most seats. That there's no doubt about that. But whether or not they will get a majority is still up in the air. It's like still, because it really depends on like, it really ended up depending on like 3 or 4 seats basically. And but of course, like Nicola Sturgeon, who's the leader of the SNP, is likely to win First Minister. Now, First Minister is basically the quote unquote Prime Minister of like the region. And whereas, the other parties, the Conservatives are slated to get 27, Labour 19, the Greens 11, which is like a really big growth from their 5, and the Lib Dems 4. So, and then like there's this other party called ALBA, started by former First Minister Alex Salmond. Now, Alex Salmond was actually the leader of the SNP, and he was First Minister for the SNP. But, after some scandal, he got kicked out, and now he has his own party called ALBA. So he's slated to get 0 seats though. But like, based on these results, how far are we from, the actual results? Like, because there was, the polls kind of show, that like the other parties besides the SNP are kind of slated to like lose some seats, and like Conservatives losing like 4 or 5, Labour losing like 4, Greens gaining, but the Lib Dems gonna lose again with about 1 seat. So what do the results actually say though? So the results are kind of close, but not really. I'll get to why. So the SNP got 64 seats ultimately. So you remember so they actually technically gained 3 seats. But 64 seats ain't gonna cut it, because you need 65 to be a majority. So they came close. They really did, because they did win a couple of crucial seats. So then like they were able to do that. But then so ultimately I think it might likely still be a minority government, but it's a minority government I suppose that has to rely less on the graces of other parties, because they really only need 1 vote to pass most things. And the Conservatives didn't end up losing seats. They remained perfectly at 31, Labour down to 22, so they lost 2 seats from their 24. Greens went up to 8, so they went from like 5, so they went to like from like 5 to like 8, so it's like that's like an extra 3 seats that they gained. So so they did end up getting seats. They're actually the only party, like out of like the national party, so-called national parties, to like actually gain seats. So that's great on them. They gained 3 seats basically, and the Lib Dems went down by 1, so now they're at 4. And of course, as the polls predicted, Alba, no seats. So basically, what's interesting here, like you might see it, and you're like, oh, okay, like, well, case closed. Like SNP gets majority, kind of a majority, and and everyone else just kind of like stays just like there, like makes up the other half of the parliament. But what's interesting is that because of like, remember the mixed system that I mentioned earlier, it kind of ended up playing a pretty interesting factor into like how the votes are ultimately tabulated. So in the constituency vote, when you're talking about like like votes per constituency, the SNP dominated that particular segment of the voting. So so how voting in Scotland works is that you get 2 ballots basically, one for your constituent and one for your region. So for the constituent ballot, SNP dominates that, and that's basically how they got most of their seats. It's by winning each and every one constituency. Whereas the other parties, particularly the Conservatives and Labour, the way they did it is actually by focusing instead on the regional list. So you see like how like the national parties who who technically don't support, at least not openly support, like a proportional representation system for the UK nationally, they actually ended up benefiting from proportional representation in Scotland. And but it's also like a strategic thing on their part, because they know they can't win by an outright majority in particular constituencies. So what they do is they make sure to get second or third place in the regional polls so that they could get some seats that way. So that's how Conservative and Labour have been getting most of their seats. So it's a different strategy essentially for like both of them. And to show you how stark it is, so the Conservatives got 31 seats, but they only won 5 constituencies. And Labour only got 2 from constituents, but they won 22 seats. So you see like how like a lot of like their votes actually ended up being from the regional list instead of constituents. And like what else this election shows, I think ultimately, is also like a widespread approval of the SNP agenda itself. So how they've been handling COVID, and also I guess like their push for independence. Now I think it's like, if I reference the polls correctly, there's actually a resurgence of like a majority of people wanting Scottish independence. So I think it's the first time in a while that Scottish independence actually went up against people who didn't want independence by like a couple of percentage points. And I think the SNP is probably going to take that as a hint that they could push for another referendum and possibly win. That'll be interesting to cover, certainly, but we'll just have to see if that actually happens. But like I said, with COVID, it's not likely to happen soon, because they did promise the people, we're not going to do it now. But it will definitely happen. Like, within the next 10 years, with just how polarizing a lot of like Western politics is right now, maybe in like 10 years, but we'll just have to see. But if that happens, we'll be covering it. So anyways, next week, like I said, we'll be covering the Welsh elections, which happened on this exact same day, and like the interesting dynamics there. So you wouldn't want to miss that as well. If you're on Spotify, please follow the podcast, and if you're on YouTube, the usual: comment, like, subscribe. But anyways, I'll see you next week for that then.